right, thanks everybody for coming out to our panel discussion about where the Midwest ends and where the Great Plains begin. If there is such a dividing line, we will debate that here today. Want to thank the Northern Great Plains History Conference for putting on a great show. Graham Wrightson in particular. He's not here at the moment, but Graham Wrightsman, the historian at SDSU, was this year's conference organizer and did a masterful job. We're pleased to be here and able to present the premier experts on the field on this question. Before we launch into our first speaker, Tom Isern, I just wanted to give a plug for the brand new issue of Middle West Review that came out yesterday. If you are a subscriber, yours will probably come along in about 2 weeks because it is distributed by Media Mail. If someone here is not a subscriber and they would like a copy, just wave your hand and I'll give you this one. Lisa?
Yes. Thank you. It didn't last long.
The cover, I just wanted to say, is an image chosen by Middle West Review editor Chris Laingen, and it features an old study done by a geographer in the 1950s where he took a questionnaire and he mailed it out from Chicago to postmasters around the country and asked them to check a box and say if they are in the Midwest or not. And if I could show the cover of this, you can see this is the rough perimeter of postmasters in 1960, which thought that this area was the Midwest. So it's a very cool experiment that was run that maybe some smart person could find a digital way to do that these days. So let's get into our discussion today. We're going to start with the premier historian of the Great Plains, Tom Isern, the great Tom Isern of North Dakota State University. He is a professor of history and a distinguished university professor at NDSU. He has written a bunch of books and articles and thousands of newspaper and radio essays about life on the Great Plains of North America. And last summer, I'm happy to report at the Midwestern History Association meeting in Michigan, he was awarded the Frederick Jackson Turner Award for lifetime achievement to the study of the Midwest and the plains in our part of the country. Most recently, he celebrated his family farm's sesquicentennial down in western Kansas. So please welcome Tom.
To all of that, I will say, it's often better to have friends than to be smart. Thank you. Oh, come all you jolly fellows and listen to my song. There are not many verses, it will not detain you long. It's concerning some young fellows who did agree to go and spend one summer pleasantly on the range of Buffalo. It was in the spring of '83. A jesting son hired me. He says, young man, I want you to go and follow my herd to Mexico. I'm looking rather seedy now while holding down my claim, and my victuals are not always served the best. And the mice play shyly round me as I lay me down to sleep in my little old sod shanty in the west. Now, what shall I say of these three ballads of the Great Plains? There arose on the prairies a distinctive folk literature peculiar to the region. Other places had their lore, but this was without peer among regions. The ballads emerged from the peculiar circumstances of the successive settlements of the Great Plains. They are indeed definitional as to the region. although their role has passed from currency into historicity. It is by the accretion of layers of narrative, such as this, that a region and a regional identity are constructed. For ballads, as for regions, there are no borders, no boundaries of space or time. For the definition of a region is not a matter of perimeters, but of parameters. The common elements discernible, and more important, told, embodied in narrative. When I teach the history of the Great Plains, I begin with an exercise. Give me 3 adjectives to describe the Great Plains of North America. And what are yours? Well, maybe we'll get them later. My previous favorite, though, was always mysterious. Oh, my. Closely rivaled, however, now by one from my current cohort of students, bloody. Jesus, that's right out of Acts 1:19. So the adjectives, these are the parameters. Well, except they're also fragments, as are events, individual events in time or space. Unless we can articulate parameters that are strings, not mere points. A generous generation ago, I presented a paper to the WHA that Chaz Peterson was kind enough to publish in the WHQ. Farmers, Ranchers, and Stockmen of the Flint Hills was its title, and its approach was social scientific. It posed a model for doing regional history. The 4 elements to be considered were cultural heritage, environmental determinants, metropolitan influences, and technological innovations. I was a lot smarter then than I am now. I thought a model of multiple causation was the way to pull together the atomized regional parts. I still pose this 4-point model early in each offering of my course on the Great Plain. When it seems worn, I dress it up with a cloak of complexity. When it seizes up, I grease it with a few shots of chaos, until the machine goes into the ditch. And then I admit, this thing ain't working. What shall we do? How can we make sense of this human experience? The answer, dummy, is in that phrase, human experience. This lies in the realm of the humanities. And so the answer has to be narrative. Narrative that can articulate complexity and absorb chaos. The strings are narrative. Regions and regional identities are products of human agency extruded as stories. Stories of 3 kinds or levels, I think. Grassroots, vernacular. Everyday experiences, like going barefoot in a stubble field. Yes, Molly Rozum, we are indeed products of the American earth. And you taught us what this vernacular sense of place leads to. For when those barefoot girls and boys get together, they form that Freemasonry of which Cather writes. Their innocent sense of place congeals into a formal region. This second level is the work of writers, artists, scholars of a certain sort. But there's a 3rd level of narrative, such as we see in John Lauck's Peak Midwest chapter of Good Country. This meta-narrative synthesizes and reflects, pauses, then turns, first epistemological and then visionary. How do we know what we know? How do we feel about it? And then, what should we do about it? I say we leave old Krigo's bones to bleach on the range of the buffalo and proceed on. So, for concluding quickly, let me flash just one bit of epistemology and then one little bit of vision. The oldest academic regional study center on the Great Plains of North America is the Institute for Regional Studies, founded in 1950 at North Dakota Agricultural College. It was the creation of a German linguist from the Texas Hill Country named Hans Giesecke. I read from one of his founding statements, headed, "The responsibility of the Institute for Regional Studies in promoting a scholarly interpretation of the culture of the Great Plains region." He writes, "We in the Plains have done relatively little in this challenging field. We appeared in the field so recently that our outstanding characteristic is perhaps instability. We had to learn new ways to meet a new environment, but found ourselves clinging doggedly to the institutions developed elsewhere. We have paid little attention to any overall interpretation," that's that meta-narrative, "of what we have been about. It appears, therefore, that the Institute for Regional Studies has an obligation to meet." Giesecke speaks here, not of the vernacular, not of the formal, but of the meta-narrative of region. Epistemologically speaking, in Dean Giesecke's terms and judgment, I think we still have quite a ways to go. As for the visionary, I commend to you the new Finkelstein and Hyde anthology, Reconsidering Region in the Era of New Nationalism, out of Nebraska, wherein the editors observe, regional identification is ripe for historical analysis because it is so pertinent to collective and personal identity. My life on the plains. By this anthology, I am moved by Jennifer Rittenhouse to contemplate the persistent problem of grievance as a philosophy of life in the regions. Grievance, indeed, is today so potent and toxic that it debilitates us in the face of that challenge of which Lawrence Culver writes in the same work, Climate. We cannot respond to it because we cannot name it. Well, is there any reason for hope? In Rawlins County, Kansas, January of 1880, the Atwood Literary Society culminated its monthly meeting with a debate. Question: do the signs of the times indicate a downfall of the Republic? Debate was forceful, discussion animated, as auditors jumped in to interrupt the designated debaters. The judges found for the affirmative. Really? You gathered in your one-room country school for literary proceedings spanning 2 hours or more, then vigorously debated the very fate of democracy, but you think the Republic is doomed? Well, I think not. So shall we then carry on?
Thank you, Tom. Up next, Molly Rozum. She is the Ronald Nelson Chair of Great Plains and South Dakota History at the University of South Dakota, and the author of the new book, which Tom just mentioned, Grasslands Grown, Creating Place on the U.S. Northern Plains and Canadian Prairies, which was published by the University of Nebraska Press and the University of Manitoba Press. She's also co-editor with Lori Lalem of the book Equality at the Ballot Box, Votes for Women on the Northern Great Plains, published by South Dakota State Historical Society Press in 2019. Molly grew up in Mitchell, South Dakota. Please welcome Molly.
Thank you. I was sort of relieved when I saw the lineup because I thought Julie Courtwright's gonna have to follow Tom. And I'm not gonna sing for you today, but it's a lovely presentation. Hard act to follow, the premier regional historian for the Great Plains. But I'm thrilled to be a part of this session to think about regional identity and the different ways that we can put it together. But my first answer to the question, where does the Middle West end and the Plains begin, is that it is a matter of when as much as where. When in basic chronological time and when in generational time. We want to ask what regional labels circulated in any given time and space, and who specifically identified with those labels, and why they found such regional labels meaningful. We should pay attention to moments when regional labels emerge, change, compete, and conflict. As a cultural historian, I take the question to be one of cultural geography, not solely one of topography, geology, climate, and natural ecology, although all of those things are a part of regions. Middle West is mostly a cultural geographic region, while Great Plains refers frequently to both a particular natural environment and a cultural geographic region. To answer the question specifically, and here I'm following the geographer James Shortridge, the modern Middle West emerged as a north-south ordering device in the mid to late 19th century when settler colonials began to reach the grasslands west at the center of North America. A Middle West to distinguish Kansas and Nebraska from both the south of Indian Territory and Texas and the new Northwest of the Dakotas and Minnesota. In short, settlers needed to divide up the grasslands west into manageable locations. It's such a sprawling, large entity. Over time, though, the Middle West became a region that both drew from and became distinguished from the North, South, and the West. Continentally speaking, the Middle West is an eastern region. The Middle West became an area associated with high levels of row crop agriculture, even when any given state or area had significant urbanization and industrial production of goods, in addition to agricultural products. The Middle West, over time, expanded west into the Dakotas and as modern commercial then industrial agriculture began to replace ever more significant portions of grasslands. The Great Plains began to emerge in the national imagination as a cultural region as it resisted unaided, that is, unirrigated agriculture in fits and starts across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, up through portions of the 20s and during the 1930s. Settler colonials began to experience the reality that unirrigated row crops would often fail if precipitation for the region fell below 20 inches of rainfall annually. The region became associated with semi-aridity. The label Great Plains achieved national and international consciousness due to the drought and dust storms of the 1930s. A broad line of aridity, the 100th meridian, identified by John Wesley Powell in his early 1878 report and re-emphasized by Walter Prescott Webb, citing a 98th meridian, identified in his history, the Great Plains, mark an ever-shifting space that helps to define both regions, Middle West and Great Plains. And if you don't know those lines, those are the two lines that you hear most frequently that mark the line beyond which successful agriculture will not succeed unless you have interventions with hybridized seeds, technology, chemical sort of thing. The Great Plains is a gateway to the West and a stopgap for the Middle West. To the extent that the row crop corn hog feeder cattle complex, hard to get that all in, has moved west unmoored from natural climate constraints, the label Middle West now today sometimes skips across space idiosyncratically so that now even some residents in Colorado, Montana, and the Western Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska claim the label. They do so based on a diffuse rural and agricultural association. I want to end with a few examples from my research that capture regional identity shifting over time, because this is where I think we need to focus. The Look magazine company, anybody heard of Look magazine before? Old classic magazine. That company published a series of regional guidebooks in the mid-20th century, in the 1940s. In 1947, the Central Northwest Guidebook included the two Dakotas, along with Wyoming and Montana, as well as Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Nevada, all in what it called the Central Northwest. Their Middle West book of the same year, 1947, did not include the Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska, and in its 1947 definition of the Middle West. The Middle West borders ended with Minnesota and Iowa. 10 years later, a 1958 Look magazine article titled America's New Middle West, published just 10 years after those regional guidebooks, now included Kansas and Nebraska and North and South Dakota. So just 10 years difference, same company. Along with Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. That's what it linked up together. The article argued that industry is replacing the farm as the heart and focal point of the Midwestern way of life, end quote. The author explained that over the period from 1930 to 1958, new investment in farm equipment, increase in farm size, and decrease in farmers, and the emergence of part-owned, part-leased operations resulted in industrialized farms. That is, he argued that industrial manufacturing in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Iowa challenged the farm image of the Middle West, but that the existence of new industrial farming sought to maintain that identity and also pulled in the Eastern Dakotas and other states into the Middle West. However, within the content of that 1958 article, one Happy Holger D. Paulson, publisher of the Fargo Forum newspaper, told a reporter from Look that, quote, North Dakota doesn't consider itself part of the Middle West. It used to be part of the Northwest until that designation was appropriated by a group of states to the westward. Doesn't seem too happy about that. And for a while, it was said to be on the Great Plains, but that term dropped out of usage. The reporter concluded that North Dakota, quote, will never call itself as Minnesota does, the upper Midwest, end quote. Another example. In the early 1940s, 2 grant programs sought to fund writers who wanted to say something about their regional identity. One in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul sought to support people who wanted to write about the Northwest, again, suggesting that label has resonance. While the other in Chicago funded people who wanted to explore the Midwest. Reporting in 1947 on the success of the Northwestern Regional Identity Grant Program, the Minneapolis administrator explained that people from, quote, within the region and throughout the country, end quote, had recently begun to call the region the Upper Midwest. This is 1947 again. He explained that the label Upper Midwest had emerged from a newspaper contest that invited the public to suggest a new name for the region which surrounded Minneapolis. And the Upper Midwest came out on top. Now, this administrator was an older gentleman in the 1940s. He had lived most of his life in this region. He came to it and thought of it as the Northwest, so it was a little harder for him to think about it changing. Let's turn quickly to someone younger from the same place. In 1920, Twin Cities Minnesotan Sinclair Lewis placed his Main Street novel in the, quote, American Middle West. That's in 1920. But the diverse regional words he used to set his prairie town included the following: Northern Middle West, North Middle West, the Northern Plains, as well as one time the Northwestern United States. So we see him struggling, we see change happening, I think, in that novel. These are just a few examples of the many that come from the people who lived from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. And it's my work to try to ask people, well, what did you say? How did you use this language? These examples suggest why we want to ask when is a region, and also where is a region. We want to ask those things together. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Our next speaker is Andrew Husa. He teaches at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His research interests include small town and rural identity and attachment to rural landscape, especially the Great Plains. His work has been published in journals such as Geographical Review, Great Plains Quarterly, Great Plains Research, Nebraska History, and rural society. Please welcome Andrew.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a geographer, so I'm going to bother you all with some maps. If I can find my presentation. All right, so the goal of my presentation today, look at some of the efforts to locate the eastern boundary of the Great Plains. I'm going to start with some early 20th century maps from geographer Nevin Fetterman, who was one of the first to identify the Great Plains as a distinct physiographic region. Then I'm going to have some quick hitters from Walter Prescott Webb, as well as John Hudson, and then look at more recent attempts to find the boundaries of the region by Sonia Rozum, Stephen Lavin, and David Wisher. Nevin Fetterman first included the Great Plains in his 1914 work, Physiographic Boundaries Within the United States. In choosing a line to separate what he called the Prairie Province from the Great Plains, Fetterman proposed using a physical eastward-facing escarpment, which he said represents the boundary everywhere, the boundary of the Great Plains everywhere, except for in Nebraska and some parts of Kansas. So, hopefully you can get a little bit of an idea of here, but beginning in North Dakota, Fetterman uses the plateau of the Missouri, which ends in an escarpment 300 to 400 feet high. He mentions that railroads, at least at the time, and I assume many still today, generally follow the foot of that escarpment. He goes on to say, on one side of those railroads, on one side of that line, lie the fertile prairies of North Dakota that are adapted to farming, while on the other side, above and beyond the escarpment, lie what he calls, quote, the high grazing lands of the Altamont Moraine, the real Coteau of the Missouri, or the real Coteau of the Plains. This topographic break was drawn with the aid of Willard's 1909 soil map of North Dakota. Moving down to Nebraska, as you can see in that middle quote there, Fetterman lists the boundary as almost wholly arbitrary. He writes that as between typical low prairie and typical low plain, there is complete gradation with no abrupt change of altitude or style of topography. He goes on to say though, however, since the line in the Dakotas, he says it's plain, physically speaking anyways, and a similar line in North Kansas equally plain. The edge of the glacial drift in Nebraska is essentially in line with that plain, with the escarpments of South Dakota and Kansas. Although he says that edge of the glacial drift is under about 400 or 500 feet of soil. He says that should be taken as the arbitrary boundary of the Great Plains in Nebraska. Moving into Kansas, he uses the outcrop of the Dakota sandstone, which forms that rugged belt that we know as the Smoky Hills, reaching from the Nebraska border down to about the Arkansas River. This line of the Smoky Hills, according to Fetterman, is the natural western boundary of the Prairie Province. "14 years later, Fetterman would expand on his eastern boundary more, calling it in North Dakota and northern South Dakota a hard boundary, in South Dakota and North Kansas a narrow transitional boundary, which you would be able to see if this weren't cut off, but we'll revisit this on the next slide. So, North Dakota, hard boundary, South Dakota, northern Kansas, narrow transitional, in Nebraska, the broadest transitional. There on the right, you can also see while he uses a definite red line to draw his boundary throughout most of North Dakota, once he gets down to South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, he begins to use a dashed line. Also from this 1928 work, in this map we see Fetterman's interpretation of the boundary lines that he's drawing. So if you can see the categories there, he uses foot of scarp as the categorization for that boundary in North Dakota. So to go back to that plateau of the Missouri. He also uses foot of scarp there in Kansas to talk about the Smoky Hills as well. Throughout much of Nebraska, he uses what are called structural lines. I find that very interesting that he categorizes that boundary in Nebraska as structural lines rather than using that category lines largely arbitrary or subordinate. So perhaps he's showing a bit more confidence in the edge of that glacial drift as a boundary than when he first came up with that 14 years earlier. In 1931, historian Walter Prescott Webb pushed the Great Plains into the public imagination with his argument that the grasslands to the west of the 98th meridian demanded fundamental changes in ways of life and of living before they could be settled by Euro-Americans. I love this idea that it's not just physical geography, it's cultural geography as well. To Webb, things like the vast distances, those flowing grasslands as treeless and unwatered as they still are, sparse populations, enveloping horizons, dominating sky, these things were used as defining regional characteristics. Now, modern geographers have likewise identified the absence of features, or this expansiveness, even emptiness. Use that absence of features to talk about the Great Plains. John Hudson on The Essence of South Dakota, for example, captured by pictures of nothing, absolutely nothing, except maybe a telephone pole sticking up over the grain fields, perhaps a lone elevator on the horizon. Coming up I-29 from Lincoln and then Omaha, this was all I could think about once I crossed the border. I grew up in southeast Nebraska, so I don't have any room to talk. To try and bring it up to a little more recent here, this is the year 2000. Sonia Rozum, Stephen Lavin compared 50 previously published maps of the Great Plains, showing the disputes among the regional boundaries, especially those in the east. However, if we look at this collective map of the 50 boundary lines just put on there all together, arguably, we get two distinct shapes, where multiple boundaries are overlapping and creating darker lines here in the east. So you have more or less going down the 98th meridian, and sort of kind of here getting out into the east, some of these reaching as far as the Mississippi River. This distinction largely between those maps that are focusing either solely on the physical or solely on the sociocultural side of things. The physical maps, for example, probably using those differences in precipitation levels and or types of different grasslands. When it comes to sociocultural, even political, they may be using state boundaries, was a popular one, the Mississippi River as a boundary. There's somebody who is also, they drew their border based on indigenous language families. Strong quotes included throughout the paper, you can pick some of them out of this, but they include no single clear boundary exists, no single pattern emerges from the group of boundaries as being dominant, and the entire eastern edge wide open to interpretation. This figure shows some zones of agreement, I guess you would say, in these 50 delimitations of the Great Plains used by Rozum and Lavin back in 2000. The one on the left there, kind of see this core taking place, these areas of commonality that so many scholars would have agreed on out of those 50. So you can see, hopefully you can see, this darker color here is the core included within all delimitations, all 50 maps. And then you can see this lighter gray one that's in most of them excluded from only one or two. This map here on the right also shows some different boundaries based on how many scholars more or less chose these areas. So we see this core take place. Again, I think the 98th meridian very much stands out, but we also have some going a bit to the east there. Last but not least, 20 years ago, this map was used by the Encyclopedia of the Great Plains, has since been adopted by the Center for Great Plains Studies. In the introduction to the encyclopedia, editor David Wishart refers to the eastern boundary of the Great Plains as an almost imperceptible transition zone from the more humid South and Midwest. Because of this, Wishart argues that the boundary must be drawn using a combination of physical, historical, and geopolitical factors. As you can see, the eastern boundary used by the encyclopedia, now by the Center for Great Plains Studies in Lincoln, follows the eastern state borders of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, including those entire states within the Great Plains. Wishart justifies this boundary in writing that as these states were organized and resettled by Americans later than the adjoining states to the east, their institutions and iconographies give them a coherence that should not be divided. David Wishart was my advisor in my grad schooling, and I will tell you 20 years later, as of this week, he would make the same justification. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Next up is Harry Thompson, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Western Studies at Augustana University. He has published over 60 books about the Northern Great Plains, including a history of the Center for Western Studies, which is now in its 61st year. He holds a PhD in English with a concentration in historical fiction and has published widely in journals such as South Dakota History, Western American Literature, North Dakota History, Journal of the West, and others. Harry, welcome.
Oh, thanks. I'm going to make a few introductory comments, and then I'll touch on two areas. Problems with using surveys to define a region, and the politics of regionalism. Thanks to John Lauck for including me on this panel. The topic is ideal for a panel discussion and one we've had fun with before. It is a challenging and possibly irresolvable conundrum, but it is instructive that we are sitting in Sioux Falls, 15 miles from the Minnesota border, at the Northern Great Plains History Conference. Most of us can identify a line of demarcation between the two regions, such as the 98th or 100th meridian, but still not everyone will agree. Personally, I like the map from UNL's Center for Great Plains Studies, which places Sioux Falls, for example, where the Great Plains begins. And you just saw that beautiful map up there. I used to teach a course called Finding the Great Plains, and would usually ask the students whether they thought they lived in the Midwest or the Great Plains. One response I recall from someone who lived west of the Missouri River, which most of us would consider in the Great Plains, was that she lived in the Midwest. I asked what characteristics made her think she was in the Midwest. And she said, because everyone she knew believed in the importance of family and wholesomeness and traditional American values. I asked whether she thought people who lived on the coast or in the South did not share those values. She looked befuddled. For her, and millions of others in America's geographically challenged population, the Midwest is a state of mind, a conclusion that the Wall Street Journal reached in its article on the first of the two Midwest surveys titled, "It's amazing how many Americans think they live in the Midwest when they don't." The two surveys, sponsored by the journal John edits, Middle West Review, with the assistance of Emerson College Polling, conducted in late 2023 and early 2024, will provide interesting and helpful data for years to come. As with all data, a number of apparently conflicting conclusions may be drawn. The Midwest is loosely identified in the survey responses, especially to the first survey, ranging from Idaho to Pennsylvania, Minnesota to Arkansas, with admittedly varying intensities. Whence this eagerness to identify with the Midwest? It wasn't always so. As John has ably demonstrated in his many books about the falling away of Midwestern consciousness and by founding the Midwestern History Association. His call for a reconsideration of the Midwest by scholars and the general public has met with resounding success. Reminding cultural historians, literary scholars of the important role the Midwest has played in America is a worthy goal, and giving the general public a sense of place, however misplaced, serves a purpose as well. The survey results certainly indicate that identifying with the Midwest, though perhaps not actually living in the Midwest, is popular. Relying on data generated through the self-identification of survey respondents may skew results. The mobility of residents makes any polling suspect, for it raises questions of length of residency, where in the state they live, and on what basis do they have an informed opinion. How long does it take for a resident to acquire a sense of a state or a region? If a respondent recently moved to a community where Midwest or Midwestern appeared commercially, that is, Midwest Realty, Midwest Electric, or Midwest Bank, they could easily be convinced that is where they live. The first poll, conducted in October 2023, asked whether respondents thought they lived in the Midwest or considered themselves Midwesterners. It found the majority of people in the 22 states surveyed considered themselves to live in the Midwest, but fewer consider themselves to be Midwesterners. Certainly, the questions posed in the first survey largely predetermined the results. Iowa and Minnesota residents had the strongest sense of Midwestern identity, but people from Colorado, Oklahoma, and Wyoming thought they too lived in the Midwest, as did 33% of Kentuckians and 25% of Arkansans. Perhaps more surprising is that 30% of Montanans and 25% of Idahoans surveyed thought they did too. To find that Colorado and Wyoming residents consider themselves in the Midwest suggests, as John notes, that Midwestern identity extends farther west than traditionally thought, maybe a bit too far west to make any sense. John claims that the survey results show how strongly an identity the Midwest has, stretching even to the Rocky Mountain Front Range, and, quote, how weak an identity the Great Plains has. The 2023 poll was followed up a few months later in January 2024 with a poll limited to 4 border states, Colorado, Missouri, Ohio, and South Dakota, in which 2,000 respondents in each state were given a wider geographical range. Coloradans and South Dakotans were asked if they thought they lived in the Midwest, Great Plains, or West. Ohioans were asked if they lived in the Midwest, the South, or Appalachia. Missourians were asked if they lived in the Midwest or the South. John says the results of the second poll, quote, strongly confirm the Midwestern identity of Missouri and Ohio at 90%. The mostly Midwestern identity of South Dakota at 66%, largely in the East, and 30% in Great Plains. And the western tilt of Colorado, 26% in the Midwest and 65% in the West. John concludes that together the two surveys, quote, demonstrate the strength and persistence of Midwestern identity, and they help us to better see the boundaries of the Midwest. The two surveys show, I believe, that there is no consensus as to the geographical identity of the Midwest. In fact, the two surveys demonstrates the weakness, if not confusion, of Midwestern identity. If the Midwest is everywhere, then by extension it is nowhere. The surveys call into question whether the Midwest as a geographically identifiable entity even exists. There is, however, more consensus about the Great Plains, which is not part of the Midwest. As defined by the Center for Great Plains Studies at UNL, the Great Plains is a narrow band extending from central Texas north through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and west into eastern Montana, and then up into Canada. Another factor that makes the Great Plains more clearly identifiable is that the plains is a geophysical marker referring to flat, wide open areas. John dismisses Great Plains identity by quipping that he's never heard of anyone wanting to call himself a plainsman. I agree, and I'm not favoring the Great Plains over the Midwest, just offering the observation that the Great Plains is geographically identifiable, whereas Midwest conveys a sense of being in the middle of someplace, the West, perhaps. Why, beyond intellectual dalliance, might regional identity matter? For a political figure from a state with fewer than 1 million residents, let's say a senator born west of the Missouri River, who has national ambitions, an expansive regional identification could work in his favor. Associating oneself with a region that is wholesome and popular and seems to extend beyond his state's borders would be a deft political strategy. Most northern Great Plains states have fewer than 1 million residents, whereas the populations of most Midwestern states are significantly larger. And as John reminds us, no one is clamoring to be known as a plainsman or even a Great Plainsman. Apart from those coastal elites, stern New Englanders, and proud Southerners, everyone wants to be a Midwesterner. It's safe to be from the heartland, wherever that is. Now let's turn to the current presidential and vice presidential race. Both parties chose to hold their conventions in the Midwest, albeit urban Midwest, Milwaukee and Chicago, recognizing that 75% of those who live in the 12 traditional Midwest states live in cities. Both parties seek the support of Midwest states, not so much Great Plains states, because their small populations don't boost the Electoral College count. Both presidential candidates chose their running mates from Midwest states, and both J.D. Vance and Tim Walz are vying to be seen as more Midwestern than the other. In terms of conventional Midwestern personality stereotypes, is one more authentic and the other more performative? Let's start with J.D. Vance. Born in 1984 in the steel mill town of Middletown, Ohio, parents divorced, raised largely by his maternal grandparents in Middletown, where his grandfather worked in the local steel mill, spent summers in Jackson, Kentucky. Enlisted in the Marines out of high school and served 4 years, deployed to Iraq but did not see combat. Professionally, a Yale-educated lawyer and Silicon Valley venture capitalist, author of a popular memoir, became a U.S. Senator from Ohio just recently after courting Trump's endorsement. Tim Walz, born in 1964 in the farming community of West Point, Nebraska, but was raised in Valentine, where his father was a teacher and school superintendent. When his father was diagnosed with cancer, he moved to Butte, Nebraska, where he worked on farms during the summers. Enlisted in the Army National Guard during high school, served 24 years, deployed to Italy in support of war in Afghanistan, but never saw combat. Attended Chadron State University on a GI Bill, taught in China 1 year. Taught and coached in Alliance, Nebraska, and then moved to Mankato, Minnesota. Elected to the U.S. House 6 times before becoming governor of Minnesota. So who's more Midwestern? The hillbilly from Yale and Silicon Valley who wants to tell you how many children you should have and with whom? Or the coach from Chadron State in West Mankato High School who says, mind your own damn business. Vance's admission that he intentionally lied and continues to lie about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, in his own state that he represents, endangering the lives of school children and college students for political gain, tells us all we need to know about his Midwestern values, which seem to be at odds to those the student in my class thought were characteristic of the Midwest. How does this compare with the charge against Walz that he retired from the Guard following his overseas deployment and ahead of his unit's possible deployment to Iraq? Sounds like Midwestern common sense to me. Thank you.
next speaker is Timothy Mahoney, who is a professor of history at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He joined the Department of History in 1986 and is a specialist in social, urban, regional, gender, and even global urban history. He has published numerous articles, but is probably best known for his trilogy of books about the development of the middle class in the 19th century Midwest, and also in a very prominent edited volume on regionalism, which I encourage you all to take a look at. The essays still stand up after several years. They're excellent. But he is preparing a final manuscript to follow up on his early work on towns in the Middle West that is currently entitled Bourgeois Imperialists, Cosmopolitan Masculinity and Modernity in Gilded Age Chicago. Please welcome Tim.
I'm going to take a little different tack here. I'm going to speak off the cuff and sort of respond to things in general. Thanks to Tom and Molly and Andrew and Harry for their comments about the Midwest and about Midwest identity. I first was at a session entitled, Where is the Midwest? In Galena, Illinois in 1978. I was a nervous graduate student. And I kind of startled people. They were talking about the cultural Midwest. They were talking about the landed Midwest. They were talking about the Midwest of location. And I come in as this young, not so hotshot, and I try to suggest that regions are structures, that they're sets of relationships, and I was entering the relational understanding of the Midwest. I became a Midwest urban historian by studying Midwest regions as a structure. And then I went and followed this from Chicago, and to the horror of my parents and my friends, I decided to drive out in the hinterland. I was studying in Chicago, but I didn't know much about the state of Illinois. And then I went out to the Mississippi River, and I encountered all of these towns that I had really never known much about. And that then began to percolate in me, okay, this is a structure, but there's something here that has meaning and depth to it, and I want to know what that is. And so I want to flip the question here. Instead of looking for the borders, because I think borders is a theoretical approach that comes from structuralism, quite frankly, where's the hearth, to use that old idea that David Hackett Fisher evolved? Where's the hearth of the Midwest that then spreads across to California? I mean, in California they have Iowa clubs, or had them. Long Beach was called Iowa on the ocean. It's a Midwestern city. California voted Republican all the way through the 1970s. So I switched the question, where is that hearth? And I began to think that maybe it's in those towns. That led me to think about the middle class in those towns, and how those towns were developed, how they ran, who ran the show, who led the towns, what the society was like in towns, and that became my dissertation, Great River Towns in the Great West, which became my first book. But I still had that question about the meaning of the middle class. And Drew Caton and others, Susan Gray, who's in John's book as well, began to recognize the importance of that early Euro-American settlement in the Midwest as being focused on smaller urban places, small towns, and that resonance that the small town has for the meaning of the Midwest. I don't come from a small town. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was then the 12th largest city. Now it's 35th or 40th. Okay, it's just simply, but it's still a great place, in spite of what a presidential candidate said about it back in July. In any case, so I was looking, and I realized that in spite of my desire to talk about the structures, there was a middle class in those towns that began to articulate almost immediately a Western ethos, a Western identity, which I think Monty mentioned. It was a north-south region called the Great West. And then of course the railroads came, and then the war came, and that north-south reality was kind of severed by politics. And so these were the people who believed themselves as creating this kind of new America in the West. Now it's a very class-based, it's a very racial-based view, but those were towns that operated within an economic and urban system. And so it began to struck me that while I was looking for structures, I was finding some meaning, and I remember backing off from that, not wanting to go back into this question of the endless question about what is the core meaning and what does it mean to be a Midwestern, okay? And that to me is a very difficult question to try to understand. But then something happened while I was writing the social history of this in Provincial Lives. All of these folks, to my surprise and dismay, got up and left. They left town. They went with the economic flows. They went with the economic system across the country. And most of them ended up in Chicago. My new book is not a book about so much Chicago, it's a book about the Midwest, because Chicago was full of Midwesterners who had come in before and after the fire, particularly. The opportunity was perceived in 1872. Chicago was the place to go because capital was pouring in to the city. And so literally, I realized in my files going back to the 1990s, I had all this data and information about the social experience of these 19th century middle class people going into Chicago and running the system. And so Chicago was very much the part of it. People tend to think sometimes the big cities are not part of the Midwest. Well, they sure heck are. They're part of the Midwest. That's one of the things that I wanted to go. So I recognize the search for an identity of the Midwest, and I can tell you that I know it when I see it, but I'm not sure that I can recognize it. Are we in the Great Plains here in Sioux Falls? Did I just drive up 400 feet from Lincoln, Nebraska? I'm a little higher and I can feel it. Not physically, but I can see it. When I go west, we were driving west to Colorado last year for my wife, who's a Polish citizen, also a US citizen to vote in the Polish elections, which is odd, but there was an embassy there. And we drove west along Interstate 80, and the wind started picking up. The semis were going this way and that way. It was a little challenging for us. So we dropped down to Hastings, Nebraska. To me, that's a Midwest town. But there's something a little broader about it. The streets are wider, the lay of the land is somewhat different. And then we turned west along Highway 34 to towns that I know. I don't know much about Cambridge, but I do know Holdridge. I used to have connections in Holdridge, and I've been to Holdridge many times, and you're still in the Midwest, but you're clearly picking up the change in the land use, you're clearly picking up the change in aridity. I think one of us mentioned aridity, the 20-inch line of precipitation. Do you know Lincoln is sitting with 22 inches of rain, and that's about it for the year? Trees are dying in Lincoln by the thousands. Is there a huge change happening here? I'm not sure. That's another question. In any case, I knew where the Midwest ended and the plains began as we drove to the west. And it was an October night, so we knew we were driving into the darkness of eastern Colorado, where there's no question that you were on the Great Plains. Clearly, the landscape has changed, etc. So when I think about the Middle West, I think about the use of the land, but I also think about the nature of the towns. I also think about the social organization of the towns, and I think of their interactions with each other. Actually, in the modern realm, I don't really know how the Midwest actually works. That's the weird thing about being a historian. I know everything about the 19th century, but I don't know where Lincoln, Nebraska does its business with. I simply don't know. You know what I mean, Tom? It's one of those challenging things. Where does South Dakota do its business with? I know that you're sitting on cash here in all the banks in Sioux Falls because of the tax issues, but that's another issue. And so we don't know enough about that. In any case, while I was a graduate student, I also drove, and I'm looking for the center now and the hearth, and I recognize the desire for understanding the culture of the Midwest. Where is the hearth of the Midwest? And I remember driving south from Wisconsin in 1977 with my brother. We decided as graduate students, the graduate students had the abiding sin of not physically knowing the country they're studying. It's a real problem even today. Get out and drive around the country, take a look. Take a day, stop at Sioux Falls and see what Sioux Falls is like. We don't do that as much, but I made it a real point of doing that. So we would go on these great rambling trips through the country, staying in cheap motels together, and that would cut the costs. And we went south on Highway 51 into central Illinois of what is called Lincoln Land. We did all the Lincoln sites. And to me, that's it still is a very powerful set of visits when you go to all those sites and you realize how they're selling that even today. So I always thought of Illinois as the core of the Middle West. And there was that map in John's periodical where 90+%, no surprise, of Illinoisans think they're in the Midwest. So I know that I'm in the Midwest. Now about that map of John Lunder and they would wish it. I remember you interviewed John a couple of times, correct? And I remember very clearly John saying to me, what he'd saying to you, what he used to say to me, oh, don't go to another one of those sessions. Just stick with the map and get on with it. That's really what he would say. They decided that was the map. But eastern Nebraska still has 30 plus inches of precipitation. It still has very different land use. It still is very much Middle West. I'm fascinated in that issue of migration streams. John Hudson showed that there was a little blip in Illinoisans moving to Nebraska in the 1880s and 90s and then dropped off. There's Lincoln, Nebraska for you. It was all Illinoisans right down to William Jennings Bryan. And it was that migration stream coming out of the area just north of Peoria. Now, all of this leads me to the question of where those people go. And my current project is about how these Chicago folks realize that they can't stop at Chicago and they can't be satisfied with their opportunities, with their lives, if they begin to just simply accept themselves as Chicagoans, be done with it. They began to follow the international flows of trade and opportunity and business and began to look for opportunities abroad. As you perhaps know, there was a broad view in 1870s to 90s America that our industry was too powerful and we had overproduced. We were producing ourselves into a depression. We were too abundant. And so because of that, they needed to broaden the scope. They were already aware that although Bill Cronin would say that Chicago would thrive off the Great Plains and thrive off its great hinterland, they had reached a kind of point of diminishing returns. The future of the automobile and the steel industry and all the electronics was still there. And so I think of that. And suddenly they all just got up and left again. And they all started getting involved in international operations. And then came the idea of Chicago wanting to show how it's really risen up from the ashes like Paris. You know, Chicagoans were obsessed by Paris, France. That doesn't seem to make much sense, but they were. Most every member of the elite had been there and tried to live there. Hattie Pullman was so obsessed by it, she shocked her husband saying, see you later, George, I'm going to live in Paris for 2 years. And she brought her daughters there. And what was the goal there? Well, ultimately, I kept wondering this word cosmopolitan. They felt that it was important to be a regional person and to love the Midwest and be a Midwesterner, of which they were very proud. But part of that was that the meaning of the Midwest comes from outside. It comes from your interactions with the wider world. And so they began to use the advantages of the creation of the international travel system of the 1880s. A whole link of railroads and steamships made the world able to be traveled, and that's what Jules Verne is all about, the around the world movement. And Chicago headed out around the world, all to prove to people that Chicago indeed was a cosmopolitan world city and not to be laughed at when it suggested it would host a World's Fair. And so the goal there was to make of Chicago a national. They also thought they were pretty confident they were going to prevail over New York City. So they were playing a national and global game. My view there, and I guess that's the path and trajectory that I've been traveling on, is that one can comfortably assume there's an identity of a region, and you can use that map and those maps, and you can seek that out. It exists, it's real, there's no question about it. I'm a Midwesterner. I always have been a Midwesterner, except 4 years at college in Massachusetts. But the reality is that the identity of the Midwest is constantly shifting within the regional shifts of meaning and functions within the nation and with the globe. I mean, if you talk about Nebraska today and you don't talk about China, you're not talking about Nebraska accurately. I'll finish it with a story of a graduate student of mine who came in. He was very excited. He wanted to do an urban history of a small town in southeastern Colorado. Now, if I've been to a place that is pure plains, that's it. You get out there in western Kansas, I even pulled off the road to look at the landscape or lack thereof, that's your definition. And you see this great plains landscape. I said, so do you know what's going on in that town? He said, well, I'm just gonna tell a local history of that town. And I said, no, you gotta figure out the system that town exists within. There's a little matrix of towns across the southern plains that are connected. And I said, I'll bet you it's gonna be connected to Pueblo. That's Killing for Coal by Thomas Andrews, a great book. And I said, there's gonna be connections. And if it's connected to Pueblo, if you've read Andrews's book, You know it's connected to international capital coming out of the east. You know they're dealing with brokers in New York, and I'll bet you there's going to be some foreigners. And this is where he comes back to me about 2-3 months later. I kind of was challenging to him, and he came back and he said, "Well, you were right. The Brits were all over Pueblo. They were investing money all up and down the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies, and they were also buying land. We all know that historically, but that's the story." And I told him, so the real story of that place isn't what the locals were up to, and he's done a great digital project on it. It isn't just what the locals are up to, it's what the people nationally and what the people internationally are putting into the place that affects the way the locals live. And so there's my sense that in order to evolve as a field, regional history needs to keep connecting itself to national history, which is sort of going back to where it came from, beneath the national narrative, and then going global, because there is a global component to almost everything. And you can see that in my book, River Times of Great Western Provincial Lives. So I just wanted to suggest that. Read my article that John was so kind to include in the Midwest Review. That was really nice, and Chris put that together with me and made it legible and understandable. And I found myself that I'm a global urban historian, and there we go. But that still means I'm a Midwesterner, and Midwest still means something, and it still matters. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Our last speaker is Chris Laingen, who is a professor of geography at Eastern Illinois University. He grew up in southern Minnesota near the town of Odin, where much of his interest in rural Midwestern landscapes began. He has degrees in geography from SDSU in Brookings and K-State. Along with being an associate editor for Middle West Review, he is the co-author of the book American Farms, American Food, a geography of agriculture and food production in the United States. And he has contributed chapters for several books, including The Interior Borderlands, Heartland River, both of which came out from the Center for Western Studies, and the book Finding a New Midwestern History from University of Nebraska Press. Please welcome Chris.
Another geographer like Andrew, so thank you for being kind to us here at this convention. Former University of Minnesota geographer John Fraser Hart, in his AAG presidential address in 1982, said, "I know of no other theme that is even remotely so satisfying as the idea of the region. All the different strands of geography converge when we try to understand a place, an area, or a region, and not one of them can be ignored, which is further evidence of their relevance. We need them all in order to understand regions, and we need the concept of the region in order to understand why we need the diverse and variegated systematic subfields of geography." But as SDSU professor Daryl Napton said in his recent Middle West Review essay, regional geography is difficult to practice. It requires a lengthy startup time to develop regional understanding and to become familiar with the diverse range of sources needed to understand a region, including books, government publications, art, and literature. To become a good regional geographer also requires fieldwork and, ideally, a deep knowledge of a second region for comparison. A few years back, John asked me if I'd like to contribute a chapter for a book he was working on about the Midwest and the Great Plains, and to try to find where their interior borderlands might be. So my talk today is a brief summary of that chapter. The scholar in me wanted so badly to be able to demarcate a single boundary. Much of my third decade of life was spent living and traveling across the borderlands of South Dakota and Kansas, and to this day, when traveling across the region on either interstate highways or minimum maintenance roads, I could not tell you when that magical line is crossed. But as Tim already mentioned, it's sort of one of those things that when you know it, when you see it, you just know that you're there in one region or the other. In trying to figure out how I wanted to approach my work, and we already saw this map in Andrews, we're going to see a couple more. I'll try to get through these quickly. We see a really good example, as was mentioned with those eastern parts of those boundaries, that regions are unfortunately very messy things to work with much of the time. So where to start in identifying an interior borderland? Well, I took the two generally agreed upon definitions from those two books. which included the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas, and started up from there to try to figure out where a boundary might be. Unlike Rozum and Lavin's work, where they wanted to see kind of where there was agreement within a different area, I wanted to try to find where a boundary might divide those two regions. To do this, I gathered 10 examples to investigate both regions' human and environmental geographies and brought them into some mapping software. The variables mapped are not meant to be definitive. They were chosen because I viewed them as items and concepts that most people could relate to and understand. To illustrate this spatial fuzziness inherent in most regional studies, the final map doesn't show a boundary, but in fact one of those borderland regions. The first boundary I used was Pleistocene glaciation that's occurred over the past 2.5 million years. These glacial divides, as will be seen in subsequent examples, help set the stage for the creation of physiographic and ecological regions that scholars have used to help them better understand the environmental processes that occur there. The second map was Feneman's map of his 24 physiographic provinces, which Andrew already discussed, so I'll skip over this one real quick. A third map, which has already been mentioned also, but this is showing exactly where the line of 20-inch rainfall is actually located. Attempting non-irrigated crop farming west of this line, even with today's drought-tolerant crop varieties, can still be terribly problematic. Couple ecoregion examples. Ecoregions are used to differentiate the Great Plains from the Midwest. In this system, it uses domains, divisions, and provinces, which was developed by Bob Bailey from the U.S. Forest Service. At the division level, the split is generally along the 98th meridian, the more eastern of the two divides that are shown there, creating a humid temperate and a dry division. James Omernick and the Environmental Protection Agency created their own ecoregion framework. Criteria include biotic and abiotic phenomena that affect or reflect differences in ecosystem quality and integrity, such as geology, physiography, climate, vegetation, hydrology, wildlife, and land use. A significant difference between Bailey's Forest Service ecoregions and Omernick's EPA is that humans and their actions or land uses are considered, where in the U.S. Forest Service one, no human activity is considered. So for example, 3 Corn Belt ecoregions, the western one is shown there as part of the temperate prairie zone, or it's in that zone, are all called the Corn Belt ecoregions because of that type of land use factoring in so significantly to what makes that those ecoregions tick. Social, political, and economic systems are often products of their environmental surroundings. Farmers have long realized that different soils and climates require them to produce certain crops to be successful. Land resource regions are not unlike ecological regions in that they consider environmental factors, but at their core is how the land is being used as a production-based resource. The logical Great Plains Midwest divide places wheat, other small grains, irrigated cropland, and range livestock in the Great Plains, and non-irrigated row crop or feed grains farming in the Midwest. As with land resource regions, the USDA's generalized types of farming regions tend to group themselves quite nicely into Great Plains or Midwest regional definitions, where land is not suitable for growing crops, especially in areas not dominated by forests, where soils are less fertile, where precipitation is lower. Pasture lands is typically found in greater abundance. So the patterns shown on this map generally coincide with glaciation, which shouldn't be terribly surprising. Where glaciers cover the landscape north and east of the Missouri River, lands are much flatter and the soils are much younger and more fertile. Since the 1960s, the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program satellites have been orbiting Earth obtaining cloud cover imagery and other weather-related data. Though it wasn't central at the time to its mission, the sensors on board the satellite have captured light intensity data that are useful in myriad applications such as measuring light pollution. So the line on the above map is meant to be used as a proxy for population density more than anything else, generally corresponding to a threshold of less than 10 people per square mile. Last but certainly not least, historian Colin Woodard, author of American Nations, explains that the 98th meridian, which loosely represents where westward moving Midwestern agricultural practices were stopped, due to a lack of sufficient rainfall, is where the Midwest ends and the Great Plains begins. Now, if you put all of those boundaries together, this is what you get. Rather than the actual numeric density values, which would have gotten a little bit too difficult to explain, I chose to simplify the legend and to a continuum from where there was the most agreement among those 10 used to much lower agreement. So doing so breaks, a lot of cartographic rules, but I think it gets the point across. So what's the take-home message from this? Well, to once again quote John Fraser Hart, the purpose of regional geography is to understand areas, not merely to draw lines around them. Good regional geography begins in the field, at the grassroots, where we can see things. Exploration is one of our most basic research techniques. Unlike scholars in other disciplines who can restrict their attention to a limited number of variables, geographers are interested in the totality of places. And we need to see how apparently disparate things fit together in the real world. We cannot understand an area until we have explored it for ourselves. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chris. We're going to open it up so people can ask some questions. If you could, direct your question to a particular member of the panel so people know who should be answering. And then anybody who wants to jump in after that can do so. Before we open it up, I was just going to make you aware of something that's coming out in the spring of 2025. The Oxford History of the Midwest will be coming out. And it includes a chapter by Andrew Offenberger, who teaches at Miami University in Ohio. And I probably should have circulated this chapter before this session, because I think it does reshape the conversation, because we've all read a lot of these same authors and absorbed a lot of the same material. And I think Andrew really breaks some new ground with this chapter. And he focuses on the beginnings of the use of the term Middle West, which later on gets shortened to Midwest, and using this giant database called Chronicling America and the Ngram search engine for books that are published. He basically, to make the long story short, finds the use of the Middle West in the 1850s, and he puts together some various pieces of evidence and shows that as Americans moved west, at first, they used terms like the Northwest Territory, and as they moved a little further west, they used the term Old Northwest as they got beyond that region. And then with the acquisition of California and people moving out to the far west, they had a use for a term to distinguish the far west from this chunk of land in the middle, which they called the Middle West. And a lot of it was driven by railroad engineers and the people who created railroad timetables, etc. And that's an explanation that I had not heard before, but it makes a lot of sense as to the origins of the term and the linkage of that term to a specific space in the middle of the country. So look for that in the spring. I think that Offenberger piece will start to be a big part of this conversation. All right, let's turn it over to you. We've been going on long enough up here. Would like to hear some of your thoughts. Who would like to go first? Bryce.
I had what I thought was a pretty good question, but then you said we had to decide who to direct it to.
Just pick somebody.
All right, I'm going to direct this question to John then, because I feel like the results of the poll are involved in this.
Okay.
It seems like we're often implicitly or explicitly operating under the assumption that regions are contiguous, right? To suggest that something begins and ends kind of points at one max, right? One area you can circle as a region. But need that be so? Is that assumption justified? And I guess what are the stakes? Why or why not?
Well, I guess it's not entirely necessary. There can be parts of what you would consider the Midwest that don't fit that well. Maybe the Flint Hills or something like that, which stick out, or the Ozarks, which stick out as something a little bit different. I do encourage people to take a look at that polling and to go down into some of the details. This is how I'll answer your question. So when we first did the poll, we did a very generic question because we didn't have a lot of money to work with Emerson polling. We just said, can you ask people, do they consider themselves living in the Midwest, number one? And number two, do you consider yourself a Midwesterner? So we got back some interesting results. Some of the results were super obvious, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa came back like 97%. But Ohio, for example, came back 78% in that first poll. A little surprising. So we did a bigger poll of Ohio, and we gave people more options. Do you live in the Midwest, the South, or Appalachia? And then we got 87% said Midwest, 11% said Appalachian, 2%, whatever the rest is, said Southern. But if you break down the data, if you go into see where people gave different answers, so that southern, southeast tier of counties of Ohio, along the Ohio River, right up against West Virginia and Kentucky, that's where you get these spikes in people saying Appalachian. And there was a county in the southern tip of Ohio, which came in as the highest southern. And if you go back and look at those migration patterns that John Hudson and other people have mapped out, that's where Southerners entered Ohio and set up a little enclave or colony. But where people came across from Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania Dutch, the Germans, the Quakers, etc., those pockets became heavily, at least in the most recent survey, heavily Midwestern. So if you dig down into the data, there's a lot of interesting stuff, and you can find these pockets that you may be talking about where, you know, places stick out as something else.
In that second survey, could people select more than one, or was it select one of?
Just one. So just to finish that thought, so we did Colorado too, because that first survey, I think 40% of people said they were Midwestern, which seemed a little odd, but they only had a yes or no answer they could give. So the next time we gave them Western, Plains, and Midwestern, and then you get a little more clarity because 66% of people said Western. And then if you look at Colorado, the western half of the state, where it's mountains and Rocky Mountains and stuff, it's very high Midwestern. But that tier that is adjacent to Nebraska and Kansas and whatnot, you get some Midwestern answers in there. One last thing on John Hudson, he's come up a number of times here today. Editor Chris Laingen of Middle West Review recently interviewed John Hudson, and that interview will run in the spring issue of Middle West Review. A lot of people use his work, especially for this part of the country in terms of settlement patterns. And in the new issue, which Lisa has here, there's an article by John Hudson on the field of regional geography. Okay, who else? Dustin.
So, Harry, you were bringing up the idea kind of this almost a created or posture of Midwestern identity, certainly with the VP candidates. But then one of the things I thought you said was interesting was kind of these businesses, and they posited Middle America Bank or Midwest Insurance, whatever it might be, had the power of suggestion to suggest to people that they were in a particular region. And I wondered, as you thought about that, if you were thinking about it in terms of the businesses trying to cabbage onto the Midwest identity because of the values, or in sort of the opposite, them thinking about where they were from as reflective of that culture. So I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I think it can be both, and probably is both. Some indication that by using Midwest, who's going to complain about that or disagree with that? It does carry this wholesomeness and American central values concept. If you were here in Sioux Falls and your business was Great Plains Electric, a lot of people would wonder, well, you must be a company that's probably out of Rapid City, perhaps, moving into the Sioux Falls area. But that'd probably be an actual interesting area of study, would be to see what the commercial ramifications of deciding whether you're a Plains company or a Midwest company in terms of how you identify.
Speaking of that, Chris has a great map on this.
It's from a big data set that the software company has for their business analyst software. You can pluck names up that have Midwestern or Plains, you can see where they're located.
I pay my gas bill to Black Hills Energy.
Yeah.
You've got a northern end to these names, however.
It controls
What's that?
the total.
These names go off the horizon. Actually, a little short of the Canadian border. They don't quite extend to the Canadian border. Either one of them. No,
Black Hills Energy has almost no function in the Black Hills of South Dakota. It's all to the east and down and south.
Which goes to my point that
Yeah.
I don't understand contemporary interactions. And I'm not a contemporary geographer. I don't understand who does business with whom. And that creates real questions about, identity. I was reading a New York Times article where they were tracing the dominant supermarket chain in each area. It was just in the paper the other day. And we apparently are in Walmart land, up and down the plains, except for a real inroads that Hy-Vee has made in eastern Nebraska and immediate western Iowa. And then when you get to the Colorado-Wyoming border, Albertsons takes over completely on the northwest and the west coast, which is really kind of intriguing. And all these places to the east, names of which I don't even know, I'm not even aware of them. So you wonder about those things, and we don't have enough data on the contemporary structural underpinnings. I mean, who here gets the Lincoln Journal-Star, or the local Sioux Falls paper, or the Chicago Tribune, which I used to get all the time? We don't know these answers anymore in this data world of social media and data like that.
One of the most popular software packages that today we would consider to be Excel was called Great Plains Software. Some of you probably remember using
That's a nasty word now.
Yeah.
We stomp all over that one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna bring up two things. I thought, surely these will come up. So if I didn't bring them up, so I'm gonna throw them out there. One of them is, you can be more than one thing. Personally, I identify with the Great Plains and the Midwest. And because of my roots, Germanian, the German settlement region of the Santa Fe Railroad lands in central Kansas. And also because of my roots, Quivira. You can be more than one thing. And in a lot of places, it's really common for people to be more than one thing, but it's also common for them to be six things. Let's put a little intersectionality in this, because I'm very trendy. The other one is, what, isn't anybody gonna say that the climate's changing and so the regions are changing now? Well, of course, I got armadillos on my farm in western Kansas now. But, okay.
I suggested that.
Yeah.
I wonder what's going on with the trees.
It's not the first time either, because with the end of the Little Ice Age, the Great Plains, this is something that's missing from that Culver essay in the New Provincial anthology. Is it only a coincidence that the Great Plains become habitable at the end of the Little Ice Age? And an increased humidity regime? Of course, it's not a coincidence. Or that the cattlemen go bust and pastoral peoples are doomed, and no, it's not a coincidence. So it reinforces its proposition when you asking the question. And people sometimes don't know that there's region.
Tom, I was gonna say, I agree with you. I proudly claim that I'm a Great Plains girl. I'm not, he's talking about that nobody claims being a Plainsman. Well, I sure do, and I'm from Mullen, Nebraska and Haxton, Colorado. And I wouldn't claim the mantle of the Midwesterner being from Western Nebraska. But I have two friends and colleagues that I went to Oklahoma State with that he's from Hastings, Nebraska, and if you ask him if he's from the Midwest, he's not. He's from the Great Plains. Whereas I, being in Western Nebraska, I would assign him. I would comfortably put him there. But it's his, opinion on that, and that's great. But then my other colleague from Oklahoma State, she's from Guyman, Oklahoma, Don Worcester country, if you tell her she's a Midwesterner, she'll stab you. So, so yeah, it's very much, some of us definitely do not fit in that umbrella term of being from the Midwest, so.
Corey? I want to turn back to Bryce's question and get the panelists' thought on what the stakes are here. What does it matter? Like, it was a good question when you asked it. Sorry,
I appreciate it.
stolen valor. So,
Hey,
since we're talking about walls and bands, you know.
We're gonna find out October 1st, aren't we?
Well, I think, did you say, why does it matter?
What are the stakes of declaring where the Midwest ends or the Great Plains
It's a
begin?
legitimate question.
Political.
Like, I don't know about declaring once and for all. I think we've kind of established you can't do that, you know, once and for all where it is. But I think that, you know, the environment, geography, those are all forces in history. And I think as historians, we're interested to know how people weave into their surroundings and how they might shape those identities and act on them as part of a personality, as part of who they are, the way they build communities. Now, that's what I'm saying. You have to ask, why are these meaningful? You have to explore how they're expressing them. And I think moments of change are important. Like when you start to see some competition, and my own work suggests some of that's generational, like because we live in overlapping regions. I think Tom, your point, we all live in several regions. They overlap with our interests, with our other aspects of our identity. So I think it's about those of us who want to understand the textures of a time period and a place and how people might have related to this. It's about us trying to understand these people on a cultural level more, better, deeper. I mean, that's what I would say as a start.
Jim?
You know, one of the things that struck me as a little bit unusual about this discussion is that usually discussions about identity talk about the other, right? What you're not. And that doesn't seem to be that much of a discussion here, but it strikes me that it's important because that changes over time, of course, as well. It seems that during, for instance, a period of agrarian movements in the Dakotas, the other was Chicago or even Minneapolis, right? Because they had a problematic relation. And it strikes me from the outside of all of this, right, because I'm from Canada, what's going on is that Midwest is a popular term in the contemporary kind of conservative atmosphere because it distinguishes a whole region from the coastal populations, right, who are really not quite American in the same kind of way. And I think Harry was kind of onto that in some of the things that he raised, that it's the heartland, right? It's the most American place as opposed to the coast or to the south, which has this particular racialized history and so on. And that seems to me sort of central in the way the term Midwest is just kind of growing.
These are good answers, but are you satisfied with those answers? Well, you're looking for something else.
Well, no, Jim, now that you said, like, but that idea of they're defining themselves by not being of Chicago or but then what the hell is the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party? You know, why do the populists
That's the
include
1920s, it's a holdover from.
But the populists with the 8-hour workday and the Omaha platform, right? You know that these are things that are targeting or are talking about and saying, no, it's not just that we're Midwesterners, it's that we are in solidarity with people within these other kinds of regions. And so I really just, I don't know that I'm looking for an answer, Tom, so much as like that. I think it's partly triggered me by saying this conservative imaginary, right? Because I do leftists in the Midwest, and in the 1980s, they're defining themselves and saying, no, we're Midwesterners because we believe in a small producer kind of economic democracy, and specifically rejecting that kind of conservative view of America that I
Well, it's not necessarily stable.
No, exactly. And Molly, your point about like the when is, thank you for reiterating that, because it's one that I'm gonna try to keep in my mind as we do this too. So.
I want to jump in on the when here real quick. So in the follow-up poll we did, We asked 2,000 South Dakotans, do you identify as Midwestern, Great Plains, or Western? And Western was very small, maybe 3% or so, which I was a little surprised at. I thought people in the Black Hills might be a little more Western. In the eastern part of the state, it was 96% Midwestern. But the people who chose the plains, one of the things that was interesting was the age differential, because the polling data can be broken down by age. Older people tended to identify much more as Great Plains people, Tom, Exhibit A, but the younger you got, the less that was common. Now, here's one theory about this. I'd love to hear Molly's thought, but the older people lived through the Great Depression, or they had the memory of it, and the drought, and how, you know, the country dried up at a certain time. And a lot of the older people actually lived on farms. They had a direct connection to the land, where younger people are working on their phones and less connected to nature. This is just a theory.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that those are good comments. One of the things though I would say is, if you ask, that's the generational time, right, that you're talking about. What about chronological time? Like if you would have asked someone that question in 1940, and so your younger people are born in 1920, right? Mm-hmm. And the older people would have been late 19th century. Same set of questions. How many more of them at that time would have adopted the Great Plains label? Or would they have adopted the Northwest label that's so popular for our area on north? Right. You know, so you have to deal with time in many ways. Sorry.
But that 1920 would be pre-Walter Prescott Webb and this wider consciousness of being Plains people.
Yeah, maybe. And but clearly scientists were, even though we have the science from 1878 and other scientists, they're clearly exploring it. I don't know if you geographers have seen the 1923 series by the Annals Association of American Geographers. They for a whole year of issues, they get all of these scientists to write an article on the Great Plains, soil, climate, botany, agriculture, and they all agree on where the western edge of the plains is, but they all disagree about the eastern edge, and some bring it to 96 meridian. The Great Plains, they say, is the South Dakota, Minnesota boundary line, or they say the the climate person said you could do unaided agriculture all the way to the 104th meridian in the north area. Part of what they're doing there too is distinguish between northern areas of the Great Plains and southern areas of the Great Plains, which is also going to add some variety. One agriculturalist kind of admitted, he said, well, you know, when you talk to people out here, he had this in his scientific article, when you talk to people out here, they generally define the Great Plains as a much broader area than we would. And he said, so he left that in, right? And he said, so even in the 20s, they're kind of asking these questions, and they don't disagree completely, but they're trying to wedge in the factors that so even before Webb, and Webb is using their stuff. Okay. Webb is using some of their stuff to write his book.
Yes, sir.
This attempt is for you.
Oh, okay.
Related to Homeless Where the Heart Is, kind of. In 1927, in Deadwood, there was a fashion store owned by a guy named Blumenthal, who had a jazz orchestra. The name of his store was the New York Fashion Store, and they had the latest in New York and Paris fashions. Now, I don't know if they were catering to cowboys or what by that kind of advertisement, but it seemed like their home was out there somewhere on the East Coast in terms of their identity.
Well, there were national systems. I mean, the transport systems, and that's part of what you saw in the 1870s and 80s. People were traveling across the country in every which direction, particularly in entertainment, early in sports. You know that boxing only became legal in Chicago in 1926? Isn't that astonishing? And they fought about it for a half a century. And this created a flourishing of the whole art of boxing. and the whole sport of boxing. But, you know, to get back to this question, why does it matter? Because it matters to people. It's because people are place bound, and that digs into the deep literature on sense of place and place making and place meaning, and our visceral need not to become like everybody else and go to every store and restaurant exactly the same way. We live in a place that develops a meaning for us. Or you can live in a place, and you can read literature and they go into that, they focus on the cultivation of a sense of place. Or you can deal with people who move to a place and struggle with the idea of a sense of place. I knew somebody who lived in North Dakota, and she hated every moment of it. I'm sorry, it was just part of the deal. She felt isolated, and I know people in Lincoln, Nebraska, who wish to heck that they could live in Austria or Germany. They don't want to live in Lincoln, Nebraska. You see.
But why would you have a New York store in Deadwood that advertises for fashions unless there was some identity with something outside of Deadwood?
It could have very well been a New York a business person.
They were born in Deadwood.
Well, see, but they were recognized the cachet in the New York national kind of thing. And so you got a New York store, and people go, oh, I'm gonna get the stuff from New York in this store, so I'll feel a little less out in the hinterland.
They have an East Coast orientation.
Yeah, I'm sure there were lots of New York stores spread across the country as well.
One thing I'd like to just bring to everybody's attention, the iconic novel of this part of the country, Giants in the Earth, which used to be assigned in high school, not assigned anymore apparently, is all about just to the north of us here. It's set just to the north of Sioux Falls in the 1870s. It was written by Rolvog, O.E. Rolvog, who came over here to South Dakota Territory, lived to the south of Sioux Falls, and then married into a family, the Birdall family, and learned all about those early years of settlement in this part of the country, and then went on to write Giants in the Earth. Well, next year is the 100th anniversary of the publication of Giants in the Earth. So I would just recommend that if you haven't read it, you should read it. And what's interesting about it is Per Husa, the main character, who's moving from Fillmore, Minnesota, west, believes he has arrived in the West when he's at Slip Up Creek, just to the north of Sioux Falls here. Vesterheim is home in the West.
Last October, I was in Georgetown, Colorado, and right on the really attractive Main Street, there is the restored, and it's still a museum, Paris Hotel. And it was one of the most famous hotels in the West. So people would take names and try to give it a certain cachet, which would attract a certain kind of traveling person, because the country was full of travelers going from one place to another.
I was just going to add to that. It's also a 1951 opera based on Giants of the Earth, and the Sioux Falls Symphony is performing it.
And our conference, our Dakota conference, which is held 2 days before the performance of the symphony, we're doing that in kind of celebration with the symphony. They asked for some additional organizations in Sioux Falls to support the performance. So, yeah. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning opera.
Seeing no more hands, I think we're going to give all our panelists a hand and wrap this up.